Before getting started. Welcome everyone and bonjour to everyone calling in today. My name is Robin Ludi. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the manager of workplace learning at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver. I'm really looking forward to hosting the second installment of CEWIL's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion and Work Integrated Learning series today. I'm also a grateful guest living, learning, and working on the unceded, traditional, and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Knowing that we're all calling in from different places and spaces today, I would like to take the time to acknowledge the original owners, stewards, and caretakers of Turtle Island and the lands upon which we gather. Acknowledging the stolen land that we're on is critical to grounding ourselves in these conversations around equity, diversity, and inclusion, as it's important to remind ourselves the extensive history of inequities and injustices that are represented by the very land that supports the work integrated learning experiences we all work to facilitate, and to honor the stories and practices and voices that have been silenced over many, many years. If you don't know the Indigenous territories of the lands you're on, I encourage you to visit this URL here, which I'll ask my colleague Natalie to put in the chat for you all, and allows you to locate those territories that you're on. This map does have inaccuracies. However, I think it provides a guide for us all to begin to locate ourselves in the land and its original owners. This session today is part of a broader series hosted by CEWIL Canada, and on behalf of the Professional Development Committee, we welcome all of you here today. By way of introducing yourselves, I'll ask everyone to take a minute to introduce yourself with your name, institution, the role that you hold in your institution or organization, and the Indigenous territory that you're on, and just pop that into the chat. So I'll invite you all to do that now. While you're all doing that, I will continue to review a few administrative items before we get started, although by now I'm sure many of us are well versed and familiar with Zoom meeting etiquette, but just as a reminder, a few administrative items. We'll be showing a presentation of slides throughout the session today. So in addition to the little squares of faces of the panelists that you'll see when they speak, you'll see a PowerPoint slide as well. So please feel free to adjust the view on your screen now if you want to select speaker view or switch to side-by-side view or gallery view. And I'll invite you to make those adjustments at the top of your screen. I think it's top right-hand side of your screen. We will be recording this session today, and the link will be made accessible to the public on CEWIL's website in a few short days after this session. If you experience any technical issues throughout the session today, please direct those to the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and my colleague from the CEWIL Professional Development Committee, Natalie Roper, will be able to assist you. We hope. We will also be making use of the Q&A feature on Zoom, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we're hoping to hold at least 10 minutes at the end of this session to get to some of your questions for our panelists. So throughout the session today, as questions emerge, please make use of the Q&A, and we hope to prioritize a few questions at the end of the session. And you can address your questions to one panelist in particular or all of the panelists using this function. We'll just wait just a few more minutes and allow some of the introductions and acknowledgements of Indigenous territories to come into the chat. Thank you all for sharing and welcome. All right. Please continue to introduce yourself and the Indigenous lands that you're on if you haven't had a chance to. This series around equity, diversity, and inclusion comes at a time of global conversation. It has never been more critical for us in our community to not only listen and learn from the voices that have and continue to be silenced, but lean into the discomfort that often emerges from these conversations and start taking actionable steps forward. As a cisgendered white woman, I want to acknowledge the incredibly privileged perspective that I bring into this space here today. And I hope to unlearn and relearn alongside many of you as we listen to the stories that are shared by our panelists. I hope that moving forward, we can use our collective power as a community to do the work that needs to be done to address racism and dismantle systemic barriers experienced by so many to create greater access to more inclusive and equitable experiences for all students. I am joined today by 4 incredible panelists who are going to share their experiences on equity, diversity, and inclusion and work integrated learning. And while we are focused on work integrated learning, I do want to acknowledge the intersectional aspect of our identities and invite our panelists today to bring in and speak to any of their experiences around equity, diversity, and inclusion as it intersects with who they are in any of the spaces that they may find themselves. On that note, I would like to stop speaking and turn it over to each of our panelists for a brief introduction to themselves, starting with Kate.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here and speak to you all. Again, my name is Kate Tutu. I graduated from Ryerson University in 2019. I majored in sociology, and in my time there, I was able to luckily experience a pilot program that was created by a professor and a career advisor, and they were able to pair theoretical and practical work, which allowed me to really understand career development, as well as when it came to equity and inclusion. I also had a great experience with the city of Toronto for a short period of time, where again, I was able to be a research trainee with the strategic and strategies team, And that was, again, another great integrated learning experience where I was able to apply my academic learning and the hard skills that I learned there into, again, real world experiences. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name's Dina. I'm currently in my 4th year of biomedical sciences at Brock University, and I'm in the 2020-2021 cycle applying for med school this year. I'm half Egyptian and half Palestinian, but I was born and raised in Welland, Ontario. So as a person with immigrant parents, it was really important to me to get any advantage I could in pursuing a professional degree, because I was also the first person in my family to be doing that. So at Brock, that meant I joined a co-curricular program. So they set me up with volunteering, job shadows, experiential learning, all of that stuff. I was also able to do an NSERC research grant. So that's something that I'm really proud of. So I have a lot of experiential learning that comes from like the medical field. Yeah, that's me.
Hi everyone, my name is Christina. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently in my 5th year. I'm studying English literature at the University of British Columbia. The work I've done mainly focuses in the field of student affairs and higher education, which I'm actually applying for my master's degree in higher education right now. So these positions kind of started off as a co-op position through the UBC Arts Co-op program, where I worked at the Center for Student Involvement and Careers at UBC. And since then, it has kind of been a jumping off point. So I worked in a variety of different spaces supporting first year students in a program we have called Collegia. I'm working with the SLC, which is a leadership conference, which is entirely run and planned by students, as well as my current role. I actually see my supervisors here in the chat. Hi, thanks for coming, which is supporting the employer and alumni engagement team.
Hi everyone, my name is Jaba Kofi. I'm also at UBC doing international relations and creative writing. I'm joining you from Vancouver, the traditional ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. I'm here as an international student and a refugee, and I've been very privileged to be a co-op student, but also to work for the co-op office. So having that experience from both sides, and also I've been involved in a number of applied research opportunities while at UBC. Most of my work has to do with advocacy. Growing up as a refugee has really given me a calling to be involved in anything EDI related. So I'm very excited for this opportunity to speak to you today and to listen, to share some of the learnings in hope that you can collectively move forward and create the change that we need. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists and welcome. And I'm very excited to have such a diversity of experiences and humans here today to share your stories. So we will move right along into our first question. We'll move through a series of 4 different questions, and our panelists will have an opportunity to respond to each of those. And then hopefully we'll have time, about in between 8 and 10 minutes is what I'm aiming for in terms of having, answering some of the community questions. So our first question for our panelists today is, given your work integrated learning experiences that you have had, what has been some of the highlights and or challenges that you've experienced? And I will turn it to Dina to respond first.
Okay, I want to start by saying that I was really fortunate to be able to pay for the work integrated learning experiences that I've had through my co-curricular program, because at least at Brock, it's kind of hard to find these experiences and opportunities because they're often an like extra cost on top of tuition. But that being said, I guess the highlight of my experiences is the quality of the learning in terms of what I've acquired from about applying to medical school, professionalism in general, about all of these different fields. We've had presentations from professionals in almost every medical field. So I think the quality of what I've learned is pretty high. I've had such diverse volunteering experiences. So I think those are my main highlights. But I'd say the greatest challenge, and it's been consistent through all of my experiences, is that myself and my other peers of color were still the minority in these spaces. So when I started university, I came from a small town. It was predominantly white. And I thought, like, I was so happy to see all of these people of color at my school, and especially in my program. I was like, wow, there's people who look like me. They want to do the same things as me. This is great. But once I started doing like career development and professionalism workshops, I was the minority again. And my peers of color weren't in these spaces. So I think that's been the greatest challenge. And having been in university much longer, I've realized that that's systemic. And talking to my friends of color, they say, like, it's hard to see yourself in those spaces when, like, you're still the minority. It's really hard to feel like you don't fit somewhere. So I think it's just difficult to feel like you don't belong somewhere, or just being the minority in a space is really hard. So I think that's been my greatest challenge.
Thanks, Dina. Jamba, I'll turn it over to you next.
Yeah, thank you. Like I said in my introduction, I've had an opportunity to be involved with UBC Arts Co-op as a co-op student, but also as a UBC Arts Co-op employee. And for me, I think that has been the highlight, the team, but also realizing how much passionately everyone is working to enrich the experience of the students. Another highlight that I've had in work integrated learning is a research opportunity that I did with the UBC Museum of Anthropology. So myself, a professor in the Department of History and a curator at MOA, we applied for a grant from UBC, the Program for Undergraduate Research Assistant, specifically to work on the African collections in the spirit of decolonizing the collections, so rewriting the descriptions, and in hope that you can, bring in newer information, but also more authentic information that honors the cultures of origin. And that was really a good experience, not only applying the research for the research grant, but also participating in the research itself. When it comes to the challenges, I mean, the challenges are many, as everyone here knows, I think. But for me, the very first challenge is realizing how much work there needs to be done. So if I'm speaking about these objects in the Museum of Anthropology, for instance, there are more than 3,000 objects coming from Africa, some of them which are just lying there, nobody knows. So realizing how much work there still needs to be done to write those descriptions, to actually give them the place that they deserve. Also, how little time we have as students. In my 3 years plus that I've been at UBC, I've been involved in a number of student leadership as well. And you start working on a project only to realize that within 2 years, you have to move on, and someone will probably have to come and start from where you started instead of continuing from where you were. And this relates to my next point, my next challenge, which is the bureaucracy. It's I've noticed that one of the biggest challenges to change, especially to things to do with equity, diversity, and inclusion, is how bureaucratic the institutions are. Universities like UBC as an institution, but also all the way up to the government as an institution. And that bureaucracy is highly rooted in colonial practices that kind of don't allow that much change. So yeah, those are some of my highlights and some of what I think are the biggest challenges that I see in the work that everyone is doing.
Thanks, Jamba and Dina. We have a few minutes here if Christina or Kate want to jump in and add anything in response to this question.
I can add a highlight that I had. In the my 4th year, I was, again, a person that, like, my head was in the books. I was very hesitant about even dipping my toe into the career space or even learning about it or looking into co-op, internships. Sadly, my program didn't have co-op opportunities, but again, the pilot course that, again, paired the theoretical and practical knowledge was a huge highlight for me because it provided me with, again, knowledge of equity and a better understanding of equity barriers within the actual workforce. So, and I was able to have a shadow experience, which again it was a huge highlight because my professors and his partner were able to really pair me with someone with a disability. As a person with a disability, I generally don't see professionals, at least in mainstream media or in a lot of like promotional things. So again, it's really hard to picture myself in those spaces when I don't have that visual representation. So with that pairing, it really gave me the boost of confidence to, again, be confident in my abilities and validate my reassurance that I do exist in those spaces. So that was a really huge highlight that I often think about. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, really hearing, the impact and importance of representation in these types of experiences. Christina, anything to add?
Yeah.
No pressure.
I just wanted to build off Kate's point a little bit. I think in terms of like mentorship, which is a really big piece for me around kind of like a highlight. So in my first role, my mentor and my supervisor was someone I really connected with. I think that was like a very big piece kind of inspiring me to continue on. I mean, that's what we all want from work integrated learning, right? Is kind of figuring out what you want to do kind of through those experiences. And my supervisor for me was someone I really connected with and really kind of like, inspired me to move forward in that field. I also think just it was a great experience to learn about kind of the work environment, as generic as it sounds, like learning like the politics of office and what to dress and how to act and kind of like having a chance to develop a sense of professional self was a big highlight of mine that I'm really happy to have had before I've graduated.
Great, thanks everybody. Okay, I'm going to move us along to the second question here. So the second question is, how has equity, diversity, and inclusion showed up in your work integrated learning experiences or not? And Christina, you ended, and I'm going to turn it back to you to kick us off with this first question here.
Yeah, so just let me know if I'm talking really fast. I'm like a little nervous, so instinctively I just want to talk faster. I think as a person of color, so I'm half Chinese and half white. My mom is Chinese, but I'm very white passing. I have a white last name, and I think the world reads me as a white person. But that being said, I think when you're a person of color, equity, diversity, and inclusion are just like part of your everyday life. It's things you think about all the time, and it's integrated into literally everything we do. But that being said, I kind of want to touch on a few specific examples kind of in my experiences. One really big piece when I first started working at the Center for Student Involvement in Careers, which is where the majority of my kind of like work integrated learning positions have been from, I was really shocked to see the number of people of color in the office, which is like sad that I was shocked, but it was a good kind of shocked having, I grew up in West Vancouver, which is like a very white space, and was used to seeing a lot of like white folks around all the time. So I think like thinking realizing that I think people had thought through this, like how important representation was something I was like shocked, but a good shocked by. And kind of building off of that. So one of my experiences, I was an executive team member of the Student Leadership Conference, which is a conference that takes place every year at UBC. And it's entirely run and planned by students, focusing kind of on issues of social justice and integrating that with student leadership. So in this position, I had to hire 6 student coordinators. And it involved a lot of thinking kind of like who, in terms of my own, like, I want to say biases necessarily, kind of like trying to deconstruct those, like, who am I hiring? Why might I not have chosen this person? Like, is it because they have an accent? Is that like a role? And really, I'm looking into that and thinking about that field, which is, I think, work we all need to do. Even people of color really need to be thinking through that as well. Just kind of a piece, as well as kind of the marketing side of the Student Leadership Conference was in our social media accounts. Who are we posting photos of? Who are we showing as our speakers? Who are we showing as our award winners? What is the image we're trying to present, and who are these people in terms of representation, which I think is a really big piece around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then the last bit I think I want to touch on really quickly was that in this like most recent role that I've had, which is working with the employer and alumni engagement team, we had kind of like a big, Robin, you kind of led this meeting. It was like a big meeting that talked about kind of like race and equity and diversity and inclusion kind of like in our workspace. Something I found really interesting is my supervisor right now is a Black woman. And she said that often people instinctively look to her to kind of to lead the equity, diversity, and inclusion. And that was a really interesting point, which I think makes us think about like who is doing the work. Do people of color need to be doing the work? Like, should it be white people doing the work? Obviously, yes, but should they be like leading? I've seen like white people leading diversity workshops, which I personally feel is not right, but also it's thinking about, just because you're a person of color, does that mean you should be the person doing the work? So that was a little bit rambling, kind of all over the place, but I will leave it there for now and allow my fellow panelists to kind of add on.
Lots of really important reflections there, Christina, and intersections with not just your work integrated learning experiences, but more broadly your sort of student life as you kind of come into contact with different involvement opportunities and different humans that are at different places in the institution as well. So thank you for that. I think, Kate, I'm going to turn it over to you next.
Yeah, I've mentioned before about, again, the course that I was able to take was quite instrumental in just my learning perspective in learning and work. It paired the theoretical and the practical approach, which gave me that knowledge and reassurance in the ideas of equity, diversity, inclusion. And as a person with a disability, I mentioned that I don't really, when it comes to work, initially growing up, again, I felt quite distant from it. And I guess I can contribute again to internalized ableism and just the ableism within society, where the differences between an able person and a person with disabilities, it's like the conversations of like productivity and who is like a worthy citizen, all those conversations like that. But with that program, I was able to understand like barriers, the real barriers with it that society has created. And it gave me skills and the knowledge to be able to navigate those spaces. So understanding, just because discrimination laws, there are still discrimination that people face within work and even within the institutions of university. And I did have a kind of a rocky experience with university, again, with navigating obstacles, whether that's physical within the classrooms and academically, but the inclusion that I've really seen in that program, again, equipped me with the knowledge of how important equity is. And in that integrated learning experience, with going to shadowing a woman with a disability within like a huge corporation, she led the actual equity and diversity department, which was a great experience to see, because she was a living example of it. And yeah, that was I have other things to say, but I know it's going to answer question 3, so I'll stop at that.
Thanks, Kate. Kate, maybe if I could just this is organic, not scripted. Some of those barriers that you experience, and the rockiness that you mentioned. Can I ask you what helped? Like, what helped you persist through those experiences and helped you stick with it?
Sadly, it's just like an everyday thing for me. So resiliency, and like the ability to adapt is kind of, it's a strong skill that I have, and it's a sad thing that I've had to, well, it's a sad reaction of why I've had to grow in those skills, that I've just been in multiple instances where I have to adapt, and it's not even like a question. It's just I have to do it in order to continue my everyday life. So that, and as well as my close network of friends, are able to support me with again having the confidence to speak up and advocate for myself in order to access the resources that I was entitled to. But yeah.
What would have helped? If you were to do this again, and do another degree, what would you hope? What would you want to have access to help you through those types of experiences that you had?
I would have liked a more stronger support system from the institution. I know universities are huge. There's like tens of thousands of students, but being aware of like the most marginalized people within your space is quite important. Also, programs or internships or co-ops or stuff, or outreach that out to specific groups, I think would have extremely helped if I was able to have access to maybe a specific person or a group that helped me walk me through things, especially like, again, those barriers of like the physical spaces, or even just having the ability to know what resources are there for me to be a successful student. Having those specific bodies target and be visible within the institution probably would have helped a lot too.
That's great. Thank you. I think really important for those of us who are working to support students in these experiences to consider the support that we do provide, especially to those equity-seeking groups and historically marginalized populations, and what type of support do they need in terms of mentorship and representation. So thank you for answering that question. Dina, do you have anything that you'd wanted to add to that?
I'm kind of with Christina on this, but I think like I kind of can relate to her story more. But I think for me, it's been the absence of diversity in my work integrated learning. And I know I kind of touched on that before, but especially like people in positions of authority in my co-curricular programs, like there's nobody of color. And it seems like a small thing, but to me, it's a big thing. Like it makes a difference, like for your soul. Like, for example, when I was looking for job shadows, all the job shadows that were provided to me seemed to be coming from the same lens, like someone who was white, someone who had never struggled to pay for school, who had never doubted their place in a professional space. So it was really hard for me to feel like I could relate to somebody and see myself in someone's shoes. So I actually had to go out and look for my own job shadow. I went to somebody from my church and I was able to see him in his family practice. And it's just a little change, but it makes a difference. It's hard to explain, but it makes a difference to see someone who has the same upbringing or the same perspective or an experience in healthcare that I could relate to and aspire to, doing what I wanted to do. So the idea of representation is a big thing, and I know we all talk about it, but that's kind of been like the most impactful issue of diversity.
Great, thanks, Dina, and thanks all for your answers to that question. I'm going to move us along to our third question, which is, how have your work integrated learning experiences contribute or not to helping advance initiatives or dialogue around equity, diversity, and inclusion? And I think I'll ask Kate to respond first, and then we'll go to Jamba.
Yes. With my time at the City of Toronto, I was a research trainee. So again, I was learning and applying my academic experience to the practical work. But when I first entered there, the thing that I had issues with, or that I had a challenge with, was that there wasn't much of a transition period to figure out how I could, that I needed all the things that I could that I needed to be extremely successful. So just thinking about my workspace and having access to the facilities around the department, I was able to, well, I had to advocate for a more accessible space, and that kind of kickstarted a huge dialogue between me and facilities in kind of just going around the whole office to really see how inaccessible physically it was. And I mean, I wasn't reluctant to do it, but it's an important thing, at least for me and everyone, to come after me. And it wasn't like the best experience, obviously, doing the extra work to just go through everything, but I was happy to do it again for people that'll come after me, especially since the space was proposed as a universal space, but it wasn't actually universal. And I have my own opinions about even the ideas of universality. Again, that transition period wasn't as smooth as it should have been, I think, and I was able to push initiatives and dialogue amongst a lot of people that weren't aware of these barriers, because again, in their everyday experience, they don't see it, and unless it's made aware. So I found that it was important to, again, speak to everybody and give them that perspective or that awakening in their lens to see, oh, that probably wouldn't work. So maybe in the future that they can have a more easier transition for other people and won't have to rely too heavily on the person to ensure that everything is super inclusive.
Shouldn't necessarily be on the student going into the workplace to be able to navigate all of that on their own, and what are the considerations and accommodations, especially when it comes to the physicality and the physical aspect of the workplace, and even in this remote environment, our own physical spaces. What are those considerations around access and equitability that we need to consider in all types of workspaces before students actually get to that point in their transition to that space? Jamba, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I can also echo what Kate just said. You know, a lot of these experiences have to do with how we enter the workspace and the opportunities that we are given or not given to be there. So for me, this summer, again, I had an opportunity to work with UBC Arts Co-op. I was hired as an inclusivity project assistant, and I wasn't alone. I was also working with a colleague, and it was a very significant experience in the sense that we were mostly doing research, looking at ways we can improve practices, that are happening within the way work integrated learning or the co-op experience for the students at UBC, specifically in UBC Arts Co-op, is kind of approached. One of the very initial tasks that I was given by my supervisor, who also is in the audience, by the way, was to do an environmental scan. So to look at what's out there, if we are looking at UBC Arts Co-op, other core programs at UBC, at other universities within British Columbia, across Canada, how are they presenting what they do, what they have? And when I turned to my supervisor for the first time, like reflecting on this assignment, I was quite confused. I didn't know if it's me who is not really doing the work properly, or there isn't anything out there. Because I was mostly looking at what could be interpreted as EDI statements on different websites. And of the major universities I looked at, only 2 of them had something closely related to acknowledging equity, diversity, and inclusion. And for me, the EDI work is something I'm really passionate about. That came out as disappointing on the part of all these institutions, because the least that institutions can do is to acknowledge and then move on to actually do the work. So most of the research that I did along with my colleague, we were really trying to see how we can add to that void, building to what UBC Arts Co-op already has. And, you know, from the conversations that I had with my supervisor, with my colleague, but also with the advisory committee that we worked with, a really amazing group of people who are also very committed to EDI. It was always like, okay, we are doing this research. This is a project initiated by UBC Arts Co-op. It's been a year plus in planning, but are there possibilities of amplifying this, you know, to a CEWIL level, for instance, to also influence other core programs? So I think my experience, my learning experience, but also my working experience is contributing to this conversation that I know is going to impact the students at UBC. You know, I would like to believe that with the work I did with my colleague, the next generation of co-op students are going to benefit from that, and then hopefully it can be an exponential kind of impact. But also from the conversations that we have had internally, my understanding is that the intention is to share the work broadly, so that from the research that we did, from the recommendations that we gave, from the different resources that we co-developed, they can also contribute to filling this void that I think I found during the environmental scan that I was doing. So I like to think of my participation in this sense as, you know, just very minimal kind of contribution to the broader work that has been started and that is ongoing, because all of us have some work to do. But other than that, I mean, like with everything that I do at UBC, my student engagement, and also I briefly spoke to Decolonizing African Collections project. You know, I'm trying to see ways in which my experience as a refugee, my learning, living the refugee life, but also my interests in international relations, in pretty much everything EDI related, can contribute to the better experience of the other students. So the next generation of international students, for instance, coming from Africa, how are they going to experience UBC differently from the way I have? And I know we only have 1 hour to have this conversation. If we had 4 hours, I would be very, very happy to talk about the negative experiences that I've had and that my peers have had, which is what we are trying to change. So I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Jamba. I do, one of the earlier points that you did make makes me think about our digital presence within our own institutions and how our commitment and actions related to equity, diversity, and inclusion show up in the digital space. It's one thing to have that commitment and presence in a physical space, but now in this environment, you know, you had said that presence is not, it's not there when you look at sort of the digital resources that are available across many different institutions. So that makes me think about, you know, how do we digitally, what's that commitment that we can share to make our digital spaces inclusive and more equitable? And so it's a really good point. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no, I like just very briefly to add on to that. I think the way we present ourselves in the work we do really matters. Of course, also to acknowledge that there might be organizations or institutions out there who are saying one thing and doing the other thing, or who are not doing what they are saying they are doing necessarily. But if I go on the CEWIL website or the University of Waterloo website and I look at what's there, it's either going to encourage me to also continue doing like the work, or else it's going to demotivate me if there is nothing there. So it's really important to present the work that we are doing, because you know, you never know who is visiting the website looking for inspiration or looking for tips on what they can also do within their own realm, within their own institutions. So representation matters in that sense.
Yes, a big and prominent theme in this conversation today. If Christina, Dina, if we're okay, I'd love to make sure that all of you get an opportunity to answer to the last question. So if we're okay, I'm going to move us along to our fourth question. Is that okay? Okay, I see nods. All right, thank you. Our last question that I'm going to ask all of our panelists to respond to is, as a national organization, what should CEWIL Canada be doing to better address equity, diversity, and inclusion in its commitment to providing high quality work integrated learning experiences for all students? I'm going to ask each of our panelists to respond to this question. And Jamba, this is a, you ended with the last question, but you're going to start us off here with this first question, and then we'll move to each of the panelists, Christina, Dina, and Kate in that order. So Jamba, start us off.
Yeah, well, I haven't thought through this very much, so bear with me. You know, when you talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, for me, I would like to start with inclusion. I like to say that inclusion is doing with and not doing for. When you look at the organization like CEWIL, for instance, I would like to assume, and I'm really hoping I'm wrong with this assumption, that many people who are working for CEWIL, like CEWIL employees or CEWIL volunteers, think they are doing the work for students, or we want to do this for students to enrich the experience of the students. So the first thing that I would say as a national organization, you know, to start changing that mindset and do with students. Like again, referring to this work I did over the summer with UBC Arts Co-op, we had focus groups as part of like the research processes that we used, student focus groups, and just listening to students and what they have to say in the ways they would like to see the resources, the kind of resources they would like to see the office develop, or the way they would like to be engaged. Sometimes it's different from what people within, like with the authority, are thinking of impacting the students. So listening to the community members, I think you are already doing that and continue doing that. And tracking down projects like the one UBC Arts Co-op did, because I'm very sure there are many projects going on, but they are not advertised. So if as a national institution, like the national organization, these kind of projects can continue to be encouraged and actually be tracked down so that there is ongoing learning from each other, I think that would be great. And then I also think breaking down the hierarchy. Most of these institutions, the work that's done is really slow because it's very hierarchical. So things have to come from the bottom and keep going up to wherever they have to be approved. I think as much as that's important for organization, if there can be that mutual trust from like the high level offices and the low level offices to understand that, you know, like in order to make the work faster, there needs to be some like authorization to move kind of quick. So breaking down the hierarchies would be, yeah, one thing that I would suggest. Otherwise, I come back to the point of inclusion really. Like this webinar is really important because you're inviting students to speak. Can you do more of this? Can we create more focus groups that are inviting students to actually have conversations with each other as well under the umbrella of CEWIL? So things like those are the things that I think can be done to continue amplifying voices that need to be amplified, and also listening to a variety of people, that diversity really bringing it on. Because you realize that most of the students who are participating in co-op, for instance, are students who are privileged enough to participate in. There are many different barriers, you know, that students are facing. So the students who are not participating, is there any way they can also be included in such conversations so that they are listened to and the organization knows what's making them not to participate so that that can be changed? These are some of the thoughts that I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamba. I'm going to turn it over to Christina to share her response as well.
Yeah, I really want to echo a lot of what Jamba said about doing the work. I think as a community and as a university, we need to be doing a lot of work collectively, but that really begins with doing the individual work. So I'm sure you can probably tell from my thought process that it's a lot about asking questions about yourself, like what are you doing personally? What are you doing to do the work? What are you doing to amplify BIPOC voices and BIPOC staff? Who are you supporting? I think it's really important that we look to specifically support our students from equity seeking groups. Right now I'm helping develop the format just changed. I'm helping to develop a career development series called the Community Connection Series, which is a panel networking session where we specifically, each one's kind of specifically geared to an equity seeking group. So we had one for racialized students. We're currently working with the Center for Accessibility at UBC for one that supports students with disabilities. And I think it's really important to think about supporting these student groups specifically, because kind of similar to what Jamba said, often work integrated learning positions. They're for students who know where to go to find them. They're for students who have the time to do them, who have the money to pay the fees, kind of like what Dina said. So it's trying to break down those barriers. What can we do to make this as inclusive and accessible to everyone? I also want to touch on something briefly I was kind of looking through the CEWIL website, and I noticed a lot of, specifically on the page for this panel, which is about equity, diversity, and inclusion. All the photos are of white people. So I think it's important to think about in your marketing and we keep coming back to this idea of representation, but it's so, so important. What's the message you're trying to send with these photos? Who's your target market? What students are you showing who participate in work integrated learning and can benefit from it? So it's a lot of, I just want to come back to doing the work, like thinking through your own decisions, your own choices, what you're going to do to support that.
Thanks, Christina. Yes, again, representation is so impactful and so important to see yourself reflected in the images and in the humans that are supporting you all as students in these experiences. So thank you for that feedback. I think we are going to Dina next. Is it Dina next? Yeah.
Sure. I really want to echo what Jamba and Christina both said. I think both of your points together create a space where people of color and people with visible and not visible disabilities can feel comfortable joining. And I think for me, it's really important that if we're creating those spaces, we're also having policies around what would happen if we had experienced a case of discrimination. So we can control so much of the experiences we give to people, but you can't really control what happens when we as students of color, students with disabilities, get into these spaces. This is really important for me personally, because I've had an experience where I lost a volunteering position, and it was really clear to me that it was a case of discrimination. And the way that it was handled didn't include me. So the coordinators for this volunteering opportunity, they assured me they would handle it for me. I didn't have to be in contact with anybody. And I think they thought that they were doing that for me. And I think Jamba was right. Inclusion isn't working for you, it's working with you. So I think all of those taken into consideration, I think there really needs to be a proper procedure for cases of discrimination and what we would do if that happened, so that we can feel like people in positions to help us are helping us, and they are doing what they can to solve a problem in a way that satisfies us and makes us feel better about the situation. So.
That's a really, really important experience to share, Dina. Thank you for that. Kate, you have the last and final word here before we get to questions.
Yeah, I just want to echo again, my fellow panelists are all saying the importance of representation and like collaborative work. Looking into creating or developing programs or initiatives that are seeking true equity and inclusion, that you have people within those spaces making those decisions that are going to be directly affected. So at least for me personally, being aware of how distant and isolating that many people with disabilities, with invisible or visible, are meant to feel when even approaching integrated learning or even just work experience in general. So being aware of how much work that has to be done to ensure that they're included and that they're made aware that they are someone that you're wanting to work with or have involved in your programs. So again, with visual representation and marketing, as Christina mentioned, it's a huge thing when going on these websites looking through resources that even just for first glances that you know that that you are a potential person that could be involved in this. So again, echoing just being aware of actual barriers and having conversations with yourself of how ableist structures are created and how you're reinforcing those ideologies and physical barriers within your own space too.
Thanks, Kate and everybody. So those are our 4 main questions. We have 5 minutes remaining. And we only have 1 question in the chat, which I think we probably might have answered, but I'll say it out loud. For the panelists, I'm wondering what advice they would give to institutions, specifically career centers, co-op offices, to help them prepare for work experiences from an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens. And maybe just taking 1 or 2 minutes here if anyone wants to specifically comment or elaborate a little bit more on stuff that you've already shared in response to that question.
May I briefly say something, Robin? I think, as one of my closing remarks, I would really encourage everyone in the audience and also like the co-workers to be curious and get to know the students. Because most of the times when you're thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion and the work that has to be done, we are thinking in terms of high level kind of projects. But really what it takes is listening and providing that space for the students to express themselves. So if you are a co-op coordinator, for instance, are you just interested in chatting to the students about the job they are getting, the application they are working on, or do you want to dig deeper and also find out the challenges and how they think those challenges can be solved? So providing those kind of spaces and being really curious and intentional in doing so, I think is important. For me, over this summer, one of the highlights that I had, and it's like at some point in time, I think my supervisor was more than just a supervisor. She was also my mentor. And the relationship that we established whether with co students or like the students that we're employing in these kind of platforms does go a long way to inspiring the students to also like contribute more, and also to feel free to kind of share freely what they think, how they think the work should be done. So that curiosity is one thing that I would really encourage everyone in the audience to have and to take, and see where that carries them.
Thanks, John. But I think along that, oh, Christina, you want to say something? Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in really quickly and kind of to follow what Jumbo was saying is I think it's really important to not be afraid to make mistakes and be super, super receptive to feedback and kind of going in with this idea of curiosity. It's so much better to make a mistake, which you probably will, which we all do every single day. This work is really hard. And I know, especially people like white folks, cisgender folks, like you're always afraid, that group specifically, everyone is though, you're afraid of messing up and you're afraid of saying something wrong or offending something or doing something wrong or offending someone. And it's better to do a thing and have it be wrong and have someone explain it to you why it's wrong than to be complacent in these big systems of the colonial hierarchy. Makes me think a lot about that Audre Lorde quote, which goes kind of on the lines of it's like you can't dismantle the master's house with master's tools. And you need to really not be afraid to do something like radical and do something to make a big change, and then be so open to taking feedback.
Thanks, Christina. We have 2 minutes left, and I would like to get this question in the chat to Kate. It's addressed to you. I appreciated you sharing how helpful it was to be matched with a mentor with a disability. Did you need to disclose that you had a disability to be involved in that program? Kate, wondering if you wanted to respond to that one.
The program, it was open to all students in my major. So the way that it worked, because it was a pilot program as well. So it was it was building as we were going through the program. And I was luckily, I had the professor and a faculty staff member from the Career Center that I was familiar with, and I pretty much see her as my mentor. And she instinctively knew how distant and isolated I felt from the workplace. And she took that initiative in herself to create those pairings for every student. So luckily she had a conversation with me and she asked me if I'd be comfortable with being paired with someone with a disability. And of course I was more than happy to, because I was just happy to see anybody with a disability within a professional workplace. So I didn't have to necessarily go through the process of it just kind of organically resulted in that, which I'm again thankful for.
Thanks for that, Kate. That brings us to 11 on the notes here, and I will share my screen really quickly just to close us to close this session. I want to first thank all of our panelists today for the courage and vulnerability in sharing their experience with us. Some great wisdom shared and a lot of learning for us to think about. I encourage all of us here to reflect on the experiences shared and consider actionable commitments that we and our greater community can all take towards creating equity and inclusion in our work supporting work integrated learning experiences for all students. This session today and this series is as much about listening and learning as it is about doing for students, not just for students, but with students. And we hope that these stories shared today can inspire action and forward momentum in this important work. I want to also quickly acknowledge the CEWIL Canada Professional Development Committee, who all contributed to the design and delivery of this session in this broader series. A reminder that the session has been recorded and will be shared on CEWIL's website shortly after this. And we have our third and final installment in this series, which is sharing employer and partner perspectives on equity, diversity, and inclusion as it intersects with work integrated learning. So again, thank you to everyone here who called in to be a part of this session today. And thank you again to our guests and our panelists here for sharing their experiences. We've learned a lot and want to make sure that we continue this learning, but also the doing and leaning into that discomfort and those actionable commitments moving forward. Thank you all on the call again for being here, and we will see you in January for the last of our session in this series. Thank you, everybody.